to get things started. And then we'll do a little meditation after that. So, there we go. Thank you, Sheila. Appreciate it. Okay, so again, we'll do refuge and bodhicitta, the first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodong soki choknam la jang tu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chenyan gi pe suknam gi dola penchir sangye rupar sho Sangye chodong soki choknam la jang tu bardu dakni kyapsu chi Daki chinso chunyangi pe soknamgi dola penchir sangye duparsho. Okay, thank you, Sheila. Let's do again a short meditation before we begin. Just bringing your awareness to the breath for the first few minutes and working with the breath however you prefer to do so. Just trying to keep your awareness with the breath. When your mind wanders, then bring the mind back to the breath. And we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I will come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for tonight's class. So we can begin now. So now to set our motivation, let's recall what we examined 2 weeks ago in the first class in this course. That the Buddha's teachings on getting to know our minds are not just about experiencing a bit more peace or calm, some level of inner happiness in this life. We certainly can use the tools that we're looking at for that purpose. Even with a deeper purpose, we often will still have that effect on our minds. Have this life be a bit calmer, one where we're in a bit more control, especially in regard to the factors that disturb our minds, disturb our peace. But ideally, we want to come to these teachings with a more far-reaching goal. As we saw in that first class, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths to give us the framework for the importance of his teachings on how to work with our minds. To see that our minds are the source of all of what we're experiencing, what he called true suffering or dukkha, this unsatisfactory state we are in. And the causes are those factors within our own minds that distort reality. And of course, the karma, the actions we engage in on the basis of those distortions. And then the Buddha going on in the last two truths to point to the fact that there can be an end to dukkha, to this state of dissatisfaction that we find ourselves in. And of course, it's by working with our minds, beginning to examine reality through the force of our wisdom, to complement that with qualities of compassion, loving kindness, and so on. And in this way, we can achieve the freedom from all of the factors that cause us to be in this state, experience dukkha, be conditioned in this way. So this is maybe the first level of motivation we can bring to these teachings, wanting to have freedom yourself, once and for all, from all the factors that disturb your mind. Then we enlarge on that motivation to include others because we see that we're not alone in this predicament. All beings having these same identical delusions, distorted states of mind, and all beings therefore creating their own actions on the basis of that propel them into cyclic existence, cause them to experience lifetime after lifetime, only more and more dissatisfaction and suffering. And we make that determination to practice and be this topic, not just for our own purpose, but for the welfare of all beings. So we can lead them on the path that will help them find the peace that they seek, to be free from all dissatisfaction and suffering. To try to bring that motivation of bodhicitta, the mind that aspires to develop ourselves completely into the state of Buddhahood, so we then can help other beings perfectly. Bring that deeply into your heart, so everything we do tonight becomes the cause for that result. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. And so welcome everyone again. This is our third class then in this course on getting to know your mind. And I'm just going to recap a little bit of what we talked about last week. Once more, the context of all this is the teachings that are traditionally known as Lorik primarily. This is what we're looking at in the bulk of this course. Lorik is a study that is of minds and mental factors, kind of getting to know the various kind of the terrain of our minds. Last week, we talked about these two categories of what we call the main minds, which are our five sense consciousnesses and our mental consciousness. Our five sense consciousnesses, which know things quite directly through our eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and so on. We are able to just bring in that data that is appearing to those senses in a kind of raw form. It's the mental consciousness that's kind of the engine of the mind and doing all the things on the basis of what we receive in terms of that information. And that's the real workshop in Buddhism, right? That's primarily our conceptual mind. The conceptual mind, once more, is always knowing things through this medium of a mental image, an idea of what things are. It's not knowing things directly, at least not most of the time. The goal is to eventually have it know things quite profoundly in a direct way. But nonetheless, conceptual mind is very important. It's the cause of some of our problems because we are distorting how we are looking at things. We're going to examine that today, in the latter part of the class when we begin our exploration of these afflictions, these delusions, and see the distortion that is going on in terms of our conceptual mind. But our conceptual mind is also the way out. It's also the way that we begin to see things more clearly by using our reasoning, our logic, and what have you. So again, the purpose of this course is to get to know all these various factors in our minds that shape our experience. Primarily, that's the focus. Because these five sense consciousnesses and our mental consciousness are kind of like the screen upon which the movie of our life is being projected. And all of these mental factors determine what we are experiencing, how we are reacting to what we are experiencing, and so on. So last week we talked about, again, these ones that are more specifically referred to sometimes as the engine of the mind, what are called the five ever-present or omnipresent mental factors. Let me point out to you once again that I have put together this little handout that's out at the course materials. This is this first category of what are known as the 51 mental factors. Something I didn't mention last week, which I may want to talk about before we go too far tonight, is that these are set out not as an exhaustive list of all the various things that go on in our minds. They're set out primarily because the Buddha said if we focus on these, we have a good understanding of what we need to address in terms of the unwholesome states of mind that are problematic. But moreover, we also know how we can use our minds in very productive ways. So understanding these is an important part of that. You'll find certainly there are some things missing from this list that you might find on other lists from various approaches of what the contents of the mind are. These five ever-present present mental factors are called that because they are there in every moment of functioning mind, whether we have a sense consciousness or whether we have the mental consciousness present. So let's go to our text actually, because I didn't go through these last week in the text. Whoops, that's that's the pages and minds and mental factors. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. Lama Yeshe's text. I haven't assigned anything in there, but I was going to assign a few pages for you to read since we have a little bit of a break between now and the next class with the holidays. So the very first one that the author of our text, Venerable Gyatso, says that he's highlighting of these five is intention, sometimes called will, urge, or volition. It's the mental impulse that moves the mind stream toward a particular object. So right now, hopefully you have an intention that's moving towards the words that I am saying, what's on the screen, what have you. So you have kind of that direction of the mind, if you will. It's a simple movement of the mind. Again, it's not conceptual. It's not like I'm deciding I'm going to go in this direction or that. It's happening really quite by like an impulse, as it says here. Intention is equivalent to karma in that it is the main mental factor involved in actions that establish karmic potencies upon the mind stream. And we talked about that last week. I won't go into more detail, but this is how we actually create karma, is the way that the mind moves towards various objects. And of course, what influences the flavor of that karma are the other mental factors that come along for the ride that essentially, you know, give the mind some dimension in terms of virtue, non-virtue, what have you. Whoops. I want to mention this little thing on the next page. This is page 79 of the text in terms of the pagination it has. When what we normally refer to as karma is an intention provoked by an ignorant mental continuum, it is contaminated in that the mind is moved by an afflictive emotion. As I said, and we're going to talk about these, begin our discussion of those later tonight. That's going to be a good bulk of this course, is really getting to know what we call our afflictive emotions, those that disturb our minds. We have some that disturb them in a lesser degree, some that disturb them obviously in a greater degree. We'll be talking about those again a little bit later. So essentially, anytime that we have an afflictive emotion generating some sort of impulse in the mind, then it becomes a force of our contaminated karma. And then it ripens into various other experiences that we have within cyclic existence. Again, what the Buddha was teaching in the Four Noble Truths, the conditioned life that we are going or involved in and that we continue from lifetime to lifetime. So I do want to point out one thing he mentions in here. I'm just doing a few passages here that I've highlighted. Even though our entire life is influenced by countless past karmas, again, through the force of our past intentions, the events of our life are not predetermined. Just want to mention that. I may have mentioned it last week as well. There is nothing that is set in stone in terms of the karma you've created and what you experience. You've created karmic potencies, if you will, imprints that are on your mind through the force of your prior intention that can ripen into certain experiences. Whether they do so or not isn't determined in stone. Again, it depends upon what factors you meet with, how you even are working with your mind in this life. You can circumvent a lot of karma. So again, we're not going to go into a whole lot of teachings on karma in this course, but obviously it's a major factor in terms of dictating to some degree what we do experience. Anything we experience is a product of our past karma, the Buddha says, whether it be a pleasant experience, unpleasant experience, what have you. That is what we mean by experience, is the ripening of our karma into a fruitional result, something that we identify then as a suffering or a happy experience, a painful or a pleasant experience. It can also ripen into a neutral experience, but again, we don't talk about neutral experiences quite that much in Tibetan Buddhism, at least, because they kind of go by somewhat unnoticed. As Buddhism rejects the concept of an autonomous controller running our own show, there's no independent person separate from the body and mind or within the body and mind that makes decision. I think I mentioned this quote last week. The mind actually makes decisions. Therefore, the term will can only refer to the mental factor of intention. Again, with its accompaniment of either wise or stupid mental factors, those things that are informing our life in a meaningful way or those things that are distorting reality. And that's what we essentially have to work with. The second one that we looked at last week briefly was mental engagement, sometimes referred to as attention. That's when the mind first moves to the general object by the power of intention. Then our engagement focuses the mind without distraction and pays attention to the specific details of the object. Again, this is happening momentarily. The intention is moving the mind towards the object. It is then being held by some level of mental engagement. Contact would actually precede this to some degree. Context is the initial experience of the object, which may be a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral object. Context it kind of functions as the basis for the next mental factor, which we call feeling. But feeling here again is not just an emotion or not all this whole list of emotions that we talk about in the West. It's simply the registration of what we call a feeling tone. There are three feeling tones on the basis of contact with three different objects. Pleasant objects induce a pleasant feeling, unpleasant objects, an unpleasant feeling, and so on. Neutral do the same. So, as it says there on the screen, feeling in the Buddhist context has a more specific meaning than its general connotation of emotional state, as in our ordinary use of the word. Here, feeling refers to the experience of pleasure, pain, or indifference arising when the mind contacts a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral object. So essentially, when we're talking about karma earlier with the intention moving us in a particular direction, that creates the experience. We have a particular karmic seed that will ripen into your enjoyment of a pleasant object. You come into contact with it and it induces a pleasant feeling. Same with unpleasant, same with neutral. Those are all products of our past karma. So this is how the mind experiences things. As was said by Geshe Tachi in the quote I shared with you last week, this is really kind of the engine of the mind, functioning at every single moment to shape our experience to some degree, actually to create our experience, if you will, by the mind moving towards an object, coming into contact with it, and then, of course, the feeling is induced. And then the final factor that we're going to look at after, of course, mental engagement as well has been involved, holding us on the object, is discrimination, where we actually, I think he calls it recognition, where we look at the particular features of an object. So this is, it also identifies it to be one thing as opposed to another. It's not conceptual necessarily. It's the ability for us to discern this is this, that is that, which can be done through our senses and can be done through our conceptual mind. So let's look at this a little bit because I didn't share this last time. Recognition within a sensory cognition can distinguish people and other things as good or bad, or simply distinguish blue from red and so on. But it does not ascribe a name to the object. That's the function of our mental consciousness. It is recognition within a subsequent conceptual cognition, a thinking mind that gives names to things, but not necessarily so, because again, we do have some instances where you have, for example, as it says here, the mind of a child who hasn't yet learned language. They still can discriminate between something that is cold and hot or what have you, but they don't ascribe names. Why I'm bringing this up is because, again, this sense of discrimination, we might start thinking that it's really conceptual. Well, that's where we get into some problems, certainly, is when our conceptual mind runs away with these different discriminations. This is good, this is bad, this is nice, this is unpleasant, whatever. All of these various things that we build upon it. I mentioned this previously. The conceptual mind is notorious for this. So when we start talking about the afflictions a little bit later tonight, we see that they are all conceptual minds. They are ways that the mind is looking at and viewing and shaping what we are experiencing, giving rise, of course, to a lot of distortions and a lot of problematic states of mind, but also with the ability to see things much more clearly. So this is, again, these kind of 5 that are the engine of the mind. I was encouraging you to do a little exercise. I can actually go ahead and share on the screen. That was the last, one of the last slides from last week. Again, I've put the copies of these slides within the understanding of those 5 that operate in every moment of awareness. Try to deconstruct the way that they're functioning when your mind is experiencing various objects. Again, whether it's through your senses or whether it's through your conceptual mental awareness, consciousness. Again, just try to give some attention to that is happening at every single moment. Hard to actually pick apart the individual mental factors. We can think about them, but it's very difficult in the moment, certainly. And so I was encouraging you even to look back on experiences you had. So I don't know if anyone had anything they wanted to share from that mindfulness exercise. Again, I'm trying to add these on at the end of each class so you have something to work with between the sessions to kind of practice what it is that I'm trying to help you to do, to get to know your mind, to get to understand how our minds work. Anyone have anything they wanted to share from the last week and working with that? Nothing here in the Gompa, nothing online. Okay, good. All right. Oh, yes. Jay, please.
Okay, so I looked at when I got that sort of compulsive thing where I react to an old memory, I get angry and think bad thoughts about that person. Okay, so what I did was sort of mental substitution. So when that happened, I mean, it just kind of it came up that that's what I needed to do. The mental substitution was just trying to channel Tara, compassion energy, instead of my usual abrupt, but it's really, God done, it is so hard to catch it. It's, I,
Yeah.
I know I gotta, mindfulness, short on that. So anyway, so that's what happened.
No,
Thank you.
that's wonderful. And that's a good example, again, of a lot of what we're going to be working with in terms of these afflicted states when we see anger arising or whatever other delusion, to try to replace our thoughts at that time. And of course, with thoughts that are more correct and wholesome, not thoughts that are, just like thinking about things that are crazy for us or driving us in a different direction. Think about things that actually induce more positive qualities. We're in charge of our own minds. There's nobody else there. As was said, even the mental factor of intention is one of the ways that the mind is moving towards various things. If we move our intention at that time away from whatever it is, again, with an afflicted mind, towards something that is much more wholesome, kind of through what substitution, like you said, Jay, or anything that gives us kind of, again, a different way of framing what we're experiencing, that's a very powerful way to work with the mind. Again, the deeper work that we're going to be doing eventually on our path is to get at the root of all of these problems, the ignorance that isn't seeing things correctly, even in our virtuous states. But that's a much deeper thing to get to and more difficult to get to. So that's great. It's a good example. Again, but catching it, very difficult. We have to have that ability to see our minds in the moment through mindfulness, through awareness, through introspection, and then be able to catch things. Yeah, Bill, if you would like to unmute and share.
Sure. Well, I tried that exercise and it seemed that a lot of the mental factors were operating simultaneously. Is that true?
Yes, definitely. I mean, at any moment in time, we can have quite a few number of them operating. Um, uh, Especially again, these five that we just pointed out that are ever present, every moment that's operating. And then we have a whole kind of committee that comes with them that's flavored by what it is that we're thinking in regard to that raw experience that we're having. So again, you do have this happening quite simultaneously. One thing I did want to point out, and it's in the text by Venerable Gyatso that is the main source that I'm using for this. He says that the mental factor of contact, which, and again, in our presentation was the third one, we're talking about the moment of contact that immediately precedes the feeling. So in that way, those two are not simultaneous. They are so quick because we're talking about minuscule moments of mind. We're not talking about grosser like a second of mine or even, something longer than that. We're talking about, I think they say in Tibetan Buddhism, they often use the idea of 1/65th of a finger snap. So the time that it takes to snap your fingers, 1/65th of that is what they often are referring to as a mental moment. Don't ask me where that number comes from. I have no idea. But that's like, I don't know what's hundredths of a second or something, who knows what. But anyway, the idea is that this is the process. We come into contact with an object, we have a feeling arise. The intention, of course, is moved us towards that object. We discriminate it in that moment. This is this is that quite readily. All this is happening almost simultaneously, if not simultaneously. So there is that factor to it, that feature to this. The next five that we're going to look at also do tend to operate quite simultaneously. They're not there in every single moment of mind, but they're there most of the time. And we'll get into those in just a moment. Any other comments on this mindfulness exercise or working with these five? Oh, Heather, I'm sorry. I didn't see the hand up there.
Kind of the
Heather,
same
please.
color
I'm
as my
sorry.
wall.
Oh, that's probably
That must
why.
be
It's like
why I need
blending
a
in.
darker or
And
lighter hand.
it's a small box on my screen, so I'm sorry, Heather,
Yeah.
that I missed you.
No, that's okay. This is not terribly sophisticated and maybe not even wholesome, but whenever I've had the same thing kind of spark really intense anger since approximately November 5th. And so what I've done this week is when that starts to come up in this intense way, which could be something I've read or somebody said something. I live alone and I work from home, so as soon as that comes up, I blast a song and start singing and dancing around. And it's amazing how it just shifts it. It's almost like if I can just disrupt it for a minute, then it kind of passes. So that was something that I discovered in this assignment that seems to be working. I don't know why, but if it ain't broke.
The energy of it, if you will.
Hmm.
Because once, our minds are like a train, and once it pulls out of the station on a particular track, it will keep going unless something interrupts it. Something, we pull the brake or whatever, or we have an accident. Hopefully that's not the case. But if we do something to kind of interrupt that flow, that can be very powerful. That's why I often remember, even when we were young, I was told this by my parents, like to count to 10 before I said anything if I got angry. I mean, even just doing that, just kind of putting my attention to, okay, I'm just going to count to 10 or take 10 breaths or whatever the case might be. It disrupts that flow to some degree. Not always effective, but it nonetheless is one way of working with it. I guess the tricky thing is not to make sure that we engage in something that's non-virtuous to do that either. So I'm not saying what you're doing is necessarily non-virtuous, but it's probably not got a lot of negative energy, but it's just something that again is maybe not as productive as inducing a positive state of mind at those times. That's something we have to get to eventually. So we work with it wherever we're at. I mean, one of the most important things when I talk about the afflictions, I may even mention this a little later tonight, one of the important things at the beginning is when we don't have an ability to control our mind so much is to interrupt that flow by sometimes even separating from the object that we are engaged with. So if our mind is getting agitated by being online and seeing all the things that are going on, what various political figures are saying and doing and what have you, well, then disconnecting from that object is a really important step in the beginning, because we obviously don't have the ability to control our minds in front of the screen while we're reading all of that. So again, whatever will help you to do that, go out for a walk, or, go run, or do whatever, I mean, dance to music, whatever it is that you feel it will kind of disrupt that. I think that's one of the most powerful things we can do initially. That's not the whole of our practice, right? We're not going to just spend our whole lives running away from things that disturb us. We have to actually learn how to work with our minds. So again, I'm just pointing that out. I'm not being critical in any way, just that the goal eventually, though the initial step might be that, the goal eventually is to work with our minds to create more positive states of mind then. Yeah. Shall we move on to the 5 that are again called focusing mental factors in our texts? Let me actually go to the slides. I think I will start there with these briefer explanations. Again, for this session, I'm starting with these 5 mental factors, which here, again, he uses the term focusing, but I like object ascertaining or object determining. They're called that because they apprehend the individual features of an object in terms of, once more, giving more shape to our experience of them. So they are presented frequently in terms of virtuous states of mind, wholesome states of mind, beneficial states of mind, but they are there as well when we're having a negative state of mind. So I'm going to go through what our author says about how they play a role, particularly around virtue and our practice of Buddhist teachings and what have you, but also point out how they can operate in regard to disturbing states of mind. So aspiration is the very first one. Conviction, sometimes called belief or appreciation. Mindfulness, big word in Buddhism, right? Big word in our culture these days. Concentration or stabilization, we know this from our own meditation practice. And then knowledge or wisdom. I find it quite interesting. Once more, the nature of these 5 then is neutral. By their very nature, they are neutral. They are influenced once more in terms of what our mind is doing with these things. So it might sound strange to say the 5th one in particular, knowledge or wisdom, is neutral, because on our path we often talk about wisdom being one of the most virtuous things we can cultivate. But as we're going to see as we go through these, there are forms of wisdom that we call afflicted wisdom or afflicted intelligence, where we are not quite grasping things correctly. We're using our mental faculty to kind of discern things and get at things, but we're not actually doing that in an accurate way. I said that's a good part of our problem, is that we're not seeing things correctly. And so this is an afflicted wisdom sometimes that is operative in our minds, as opposed to a wisdom that is informed with the nature of reality and actually moving us in the direction that we want to achieve. So let's take a look at these individually, just using some very quick definitions, descriptions from His Holiness's book. First, a little introduction to these from Geshe Tashi. With the first group of 5 is like the engine of the mind. This group is what really shapes the mind's experience. These mental factors ascertain the object of the main mind, again, whether it be our mental consciousness or one of the 5 senses, taking the clay of raw sense data and molding it into the finished sculpture. How close the ascertained object, because again, this object ascertaining or object determining, how close the ascertained object is to reality depends on how diluted or enlightened the ascertaining mind is. So depending upon how accurately you're looking at things or how distortedly you're looking at things, you will be ascertaining an object either correctly or incorrectly. So we're not getting at this word ascertain or knowledge or wisdom or anything from the point of view of it being absolutely correct. We're looking at it from the point of view of it is just what we are doing, how we are looking at things, whether it's with a distorted mind or again, a more accurate, wholesome mind. The always present mental factors are present whether we are focused or not. Again, those were the first 5. The object ascertaining mental factors, in contrast, are not. So there, he uses the word focus, Geshe Tashi, in referring to them. That's where I'm sure our author, got the word focusing mental factors for these 5. Their presence, Geshe Tashi says, is dependent on the degree to which our minds explore the object. So if we really get kind of involved with an object, then these generally come into play. They help to, again, shape that experience of whatever it is the object, whether it's an object of our delusion, an object of our more wholesome states. These five are not themselves virtuous, but become virtuous because of being associated with a virtuous mental state. And vice versa, they become non-virtuous. They're not non-virtuous by nature, but they become so by way of being associated with non-virtuous mental states. First one, aspiration. Aspiration takes a strong interest in an intended object, and it's the basis for our engaging in things with some effort. They use the phrase here, joyous effort, but that's because, again, often these are looked at from the point of view of how they support our practice of what's good and wholesome. If we aspire for something, like, for example, when we cultivate the motivation for our classes, we cultivate bodhicitta, this mind that aspires to become a Buddha for the sake of other beings. When we have that aspiration active, then that induces some enthusiasm to move in that direction. It starts with an aspiration that steers the mind there, but again, that induces the actual effort that we need to make. In a virtuous connotation, aspiration, again, plays a good role in a major role in our Buddhist practice, because we are aspiring to do various things. Hopefully all of you are here with some aspiration to get to know your mind, to get to work with your mind, to understand the contents of it, and be able to make better decisions about how you guide your mind. That will induce, hopefully, you're taking the effort and enthusiasm to actually do the work, the mindfulness practices and so on that will support integrating these teachings into your life. Appreciation, or again, sometimes called belief, stabilizes the apprehension of a previously ascertained object and holds it such that it cannot be distracted by another view. And this appreciation gives us some connection to the object. It makes it, we kind of have an aspiration towards it, but now we even have an appreciation of it so that it won't be moved away from that again. Some of these do sound a little familiar, and we're working in tandem, like mental engagement in the first five causes us to sort of hold on to the object to some degree. But here, it's with this sense of some deeper appreciation for what the object is. Again, when we talk about virtuous objects, well, then again, with bodhicitta, as I mentioned earlier, we have an appreciation for it that is rooted in our understanding of the value of that object, that virtuous state of mind. So we hold the mind there, and we won't be swayed away from it to engaging in, more diluted points of view at that time. So in terms of the delusions, again, this will also play a role, because when we have an appreciation for a contaminated object or something that's going to cause us to have anger or desire or whatever arise, we also get kind of involved in that object. And we don't want to let it go. We don't want to be distracted away from it. And this is when Jay was talking about what she's experiencing, of when you have those, things come up that you need something to, again, move the mind in another direction. And Heather was saying the same thing, to change what we were thinking about at that time. But with a mind of appreciation, or this mental factor of appreciation, kind of latches onto and holds onto the object and keeps our interest in it. And it makes us somewhat taken by the object, if you will. And again, these can be operating with our senses, and they can especially be operating with regard to our conceptual mind. The third one, mindfulness, and this really important topic in Buddhist meditation as well as practice, it repeatedly brings to mind a phenomenon of previous acquaintance without forgetting it. It does not allow the mind to be distracted from the object, and it's the basis for concentration. In this context, mindfulness isn't just this raw awareness of the present moment, which is sometimes how it is practiced in various traditions. It is a bringing to mind and not forgetting something. And of course, it involves an object that we already know or have some acquaintance with, and it doesn't allow the mind to therefore be distracted from the object because it's remembering it. Sometimes mindfulness can even be called remembrance. It is the recollection of an object that we already know, and it becomes the basis for concentration. Why? Because when we have mindfulness of the breath, for example, when we do our meditation of the breath at the beginning of the classes here, then you are being aware of what you need to focus on. I need to focus on the sensation of the breath, the inhalation, the exhalation, whatever it is, whatever technique you're using to work with the breath. And you don't allow the mind, therefore, to wander away because of that remembrance, because of that recollection. And that induces your concentration. Concentration is coming up on the list here. Concentration is the ability to remain single-pointedly on an object. That is aided by our mindfulness. It doesn't allow you to forget the object. So we have, again, let me go back to all the other factors when I'm done. I think I shouldn't wait on that. Let me go forward to the remaining two. Concentration, as I was just saying, single-pointedness, dwells one-pointedly for a sustained period of time on a single object. And we all do have some degree of concentration. We just generally have not practiced it to a degree where we are able to remain an object for an indefinite period of time. Usually it's only for a few moments, maybe minutes. But generally, this is a factor that we do all have to some degree. It's the basis, of course, for developing what's called here serenity, and of course, increasing our wisdom on the path. Serenity is referring to a very specific form of meditative stabilization or concentration that we do need to cultivate somewhere along our path. Right now, every one of us has some degree of all these mental factors, as I said, and they are operating when we are ascertaining an object, including the last one, which I'll get to in a moment, the wisdom one that is so important. But the idea is that until we really train our minds in the practices the Buddha taught, it will be hard to make them really powerful in terms of our ability to stay single-pointedly focused, not forgetting the object, having that aspiration to engage in it, having the appreciation for the object, and then, of course, deepening our wisdom. That's the other main factor that concentration aids, not just the ability to have this very, very stable meditation, but then to cultivate on the basis of that a deep insight into things. And that's not the main focus of this course, but I will be touching on it, obviously, generating some deeper wisdom. What we're trying to cultivate in terms of looking at these mental factors is some wisdom that we can apply to our everyday life so we can have better control over our minds. But the level of wisdom we eventually want to cultivate is, of course, to see things extremely accurately in regard to the nature of reality. I'll talk about that in a moment when I go back to our text. Wisdom can be referred to as an understanding in some texts, intelligence. It functions to discriminate precisely with analysis the qualities, faults, or characteristics of an object held by mindfulness. It cuts through indecision and doubt with certainty and maintains the root of all constructive qualities in this and future lives. Once more, the definitions we're getting here, this is from a book by the Dalai Lama and Venerable Thupten Chodron, is very much in line with a virtuous approach to this. Once more, I want to emphasize that these five are also present when we are looking at objects of our delusions. When we have something appear in the space of our awareness that is unpleasant for us, for example, that is, we're aspiring to work with that object, having an appreciation, meaning that we believe in it to be what it is appearing and engaging it in that way. And then we have a mindfulness of it, we stay with it and don't forget it. Maybe we keep regurgitating it in our minds so that it just keeps rising again and again through our rumination and what have you. And then we have the concentration that is single-pointedly focused on it. And then we, of course, have a wisdom that is not seeing things correctly. Once more, wisdom, always when we present it, it starts sounding like this amazing virtue, and it can be an incredible virtue. But we can also have very afflicted states of wisdom. Yeah, please, Lou. Do you want to have the microphone? Is the microphone somewhere around? I think, yeah, it'd be better just to make sure, Lou, that people can hear the question online. We get it on the recording as well. Great, thanks.
Even Venerable Bina said that a thief needs all these same five factors.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so if we looked at a thief, for example, let's say they show up at like a jeweler's at night when, places all kind of, there's an aspiration towards the objects of the jewelry and everything that they want to acquire. And they have an appreciation of it, some belief, and this is something I want to acquire and make it mine. they have then the mindfulness that they need to pay attention to everything that they are doing and not forget what's going to trigger the alarms, what's going to cause the cops to show up or whatever. They're going to have a concentration that remains single-pointedly focused so that they don't have any indiscretions in their behavior that were going to, ruin the whole thing. And then, of course, the wisdom that's influencing this is a distortion. It's looking at, if I'm able to acquire these things and get away with it and not trigger the alarms and the cops don't show up, then that's a good thing. That's something that will lend itself to my having more resources in my wallet and ability to live my life better, whatever the case might be. So again, it sounds a little weird to correlate them with a non-virtuous state of mind. For example, that wishes to acquire things that one does not possess, which is a mind of attachment, desire, greed, what have you. But they're operating in that way. So one of the exercises I'm going to have you work with for mindfulness over these, we got like 3 weeks till we meet again because of the holidays, 2 holidays, next Wednesday and the following Wednesday. But essentially, one of them I want you to work with is to try to be aware of how these 5 arise as well. To see how when you are especially involved with something virtuous, though also when you're involved in something non-virtuous, can you see how those are playing a role in shaping your experience of it? Your aspiration for the object, appreciation of it, the mindfulness of it, the concentration on it, and then the wisdom that you bring along that ascertains exactly how you're going to look at it. That could be accurate, but again, could be very inaccurate. Let's go to our text. This is the next section here. Whoops. I'll read the beginning part of this. The 5 focusing mental factors. Let me move it up just a little bit. Whoops. I didn't mean to click that one. There we go. Zero in upon specific characteristics of an object, such as desirability from the point of view of mental maturation on the spiritual path, which would be a virtuous state of mind. And they hold the object with progressively increasing power. They are the mental factors to be employed during study or meditation upon any subject. In general, they accompany almost every moment of consciousness. And once more, he emphasizes they can be virtuous or non-virtuous in dependence upon the object of awareness and the associated mental factors that, again, come along for the ride. Here we present those that function when mental consciousness is focusing upon a virtuous object. So that's how he presents them. And again, it's a wonderful way to examine these to see how they play a role, as he said, in our study and our meditation, our ability to move our minds in a more wholesome direction. Let's talk about aspiration again, just using his words. It seeks, in this case, a virtuous object of study, meditation, or practice with interest and faith, such again as like bodhicitta that I mentioned earlier, and wishes not to separate from it. Based on faith in a wholesome object, such as an aspect of Buddha's teaching, aspiration associated with its induced enthusiasm is the initial antidote to laziness in study, meditation, or spiritual practice. He talks about faith being a basis for this. We're going to get to faith eventually when we go through the virtuous mental factors. But faith is necessary for motivating us towards a virtuous goal not yet experienced, for meeting again a virtuous object from the past, and most importantly, for maintaining focus on a virtuous object in the present. Again, faith has a different connotation in Buddhism than perhaps it does in other spiritual traditions, but we'll examine that a little bit later. Aspiration itself doesn't require faith because, again, we can aspire towards a non-virtuous or an object that is involved with non-virtue, such as the thief going after the jewels that they are wanting to acquire through stealing and so on. Number 2, called conviction here, or appreciation. He even gives it the word strong resolve. Again, I often see it referred to as belief. It stabilizes the mind focused on the wholesome object, in this case, that is found by aspiration. But again, it could be on an object that is involved with our unwholesome states of mind. Generated by further study and analysis, conviction fully appreciates the validity and value of the object or goal, and this helps to prevent distraction. I'm going to go through a little bit in this passage from the book by Geshe Rabten that is on your book list. Very difficult to acquire and kind of costly. Don't feel like you have to get it. It's a much more technical book on minds and mental factors. But as he explains, conviction in an object only follows after its qualities have been ascertained as being worthwhile or valuable. So again, in the case of the thief, it means that they're examining what is in that store. They've come in, they've kind of gained a kind of appreciation for all the merchandise that they can steal when they come in at night and what have you. For somebody practicing virtue, it means that you have examined the topic, for example, of bodhicitta and come to see the value of it, come to see its importance on the path and so on. Therefore, you have a conviction or appreciation for that object. Once convinced in this way, he says, the mind will be far more inclined to pursue a certain form of behavior in order to either obtain the object or realize a goal embodied in or otherwise related to the object. So again, that's what the role of appreciation is. It keeps us kind of engaged in it with some understanding of its value and the reason why we want to have it in our lives. There's a whole little section in here on self-confidence that he goes through that I just feel it's a little too much to kind of fit into all of this. In this first part, especially with these 10 mental factors that we start with, it's really just to give you an appreciation for how that is part of the mind functioning as well. The third one, mindfulness, holds the virtuous object, or again, could be an object, a contaminated object that we are after as well. It holds it firmly with conviction and comes into operation by continually recollecting the object so you don't forget it. So you hold your awareness of bodhicitta throughout the day and in the actions that you're doing, which is a very important part of our practice in the Mahayana path. Or in the case of the thief, so that they continue to think about, the objects that they are going to go after, to keep that impulse going, to arrange for all the necessary elements for them to break in at night and what have you. It's three qualities of familiarity with the object. You can't have mindfulness of something that you're not familiar with, right? Makes sense. In the sense that it being a remembrance, you have to be remembered to something you already have met or encountered. So that's a key part of it. Also, the element of not forgetting the object is what mindfulness is all about, essentially. You're not letting it go. You're staying present with it. And remaining undistracted, not allowing the mind to go to something else. Those are the three that are included here. They weren't in our description of mindfulness from His Holiness and Venerable Children I showed you through the slides. But once more, they made clear that this is the basis for concentration. It allows our concentration to develop because if we have that mindfulness that is familiar with the object, it doesn't forget it, and it allows you to not get distracted away from it, then you can develop concentration. Concentration, he says, is the perfection of mindfulness. It remains single-pointedly and continuously focused on the virtuous object, or again, on the non-virtuous object as well. It functions as the basis for acquiring knowledge and bringing under control all things in our life. Not yet meditative stabilization, what we would technically call meditative stabilization. It's the stability of mind we have now. Again, going back to the thief, as Lou was pointing out, and Venerable Rabino often says, you need some concentration. Just to drive a car, you need concentration, right? And you need some level of mindfulness. You need kind of a appreciation, aspiration to get you where you need to go and do what you're doing. Even some knowledge or wisdom of what's happening around you, what the lights mean, and all this other stuff that you are applying. And we can say that most of our actions, again, are involved in all five of these manifesting. Let's talk about this last one, though, a little bit more, because wisdom, once more, is something that we tend to think of as being quite virtuous. Maybe even mindfulness we think of as being quite virtuous. But it's not necessarily so. Here we're going to see the presentation primarily from that point of view of it being virtuous. Knowledge or intelligence or wisdom is the mental factor that examines the qualities of the object with some fine analysis, kind of trying to get at the object, not just kind of bringing it into our awareness in a coarser way, but really trying to see what is actually going on there. What is it that we are involved in? It functions to remove doubt or indecision, to maintain the mind in virtue, and to see hidden phenomena through insight. And those are all a healthy knowledge. We can have distorted or afflicted states of knowledge where we are not doing all those things. But knowledge on our spiritual path, wisdom on the spiritual path, does all three of those things. It can be innate from past lives or acquired through the three activities of listening, analyzing or reflecting, and meditating. I do want to mention this about it being acquired, or bringing forward from past lives. This gets to, once more, the importance of this type of work that we're doing in all of your Dharma practice and study. Everything we imprint on our minds, especially through familiarity, especially through engaging in things again and again and again, creates very powerful imprints that do carry from life to life. The reason why everyone is here with some interest in the Dharma and studying what the Buddha said about the mind is because you have some imprints, probably from a past life when you had some exposure to teachings that have given rise to your interest in wanting to understand your mind now, wanting to know a bit more about what the Buddha taught. These things don't come from nowhere, they come from our past lives. I'm sorry, Heather, did you have your hand up for? Yes.
I
Unmute.
just had a quick question. I'm surprised, or I guess I didn't realize that knowledge and intelligence are synonymous with wisdom. I thought wisdom would be something a little more specific
Yeah.
than, because it feels like knowledge and intelligence can relate to
Mm.
any number of things, and wisdom in this context would be something more specific. Is that just my
You know,
misunderstanding?
and it gets to be really hard because the reason why I'm putting those words out there, or why even our author, Venerable Gyatso, puts his synonyms for these words, is because they get used as translation equivalents in different
I
texts.
see. Okay.
So it's not to say that in the English language these are identical words, because I don't think they are. I agree with you.
Okay.
When I'm introducing you to those words that I'm, again, on my list, let me put my list there just so we, to reiterate what I'm saying here. But when we go to that handout, let me pull this down. Look, there we go. Let's go to these 5, this next group. Where's my little, there it is. Okay. These 5. So I say they're like in the second one: conviction or belief, appreciation. Belief and appreciation are things you may run across in other texts about that particular mental factor. But conviction is, they put that first because that's the word that Venerable Gyatso uses.
Okay.
Knowledge or wisdom for the last one. And you will see in some texts it referred to as wisdom rather than knowledge or intelligence. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that these are not synonyms in every way in the English language. What's kind of interesting is even in Tibetan, they often have different words for different things, like sherab and yeshe are both translated sometimes as wisdom, but they have different connotations to what they mean. So even in Tibetan, you do have different words that are not quite synonymous, but could be used in a similar way. And then you even have multiple meanings to words that are really quite rich in terms of all the various things that they could represent. We have that in English to some degree too. This gets to be one of the problems with working with this information that's originally the teachings were in the Sanskrit or the Pali language, and then they've come to Tibetan, and then they get translated into English, and every language has a different flavor to it, if you will. I mean, the idea of kind of knowledge, again, when we talk about knowing things, we're talking about getting at various things about it that could be in line with reality or could be completely distorted. Knowledge doesn't imply that we've got some elevated form of knowing. It's just a knowledge. It's just a knowledge that's something that we may be quite incorrect in our knowledge. I mean, I could say that I've got like a little bit of knowledge of quantum physics. Every time I read on quantum physics, I kind of, just like we were talking about with Western psychology and Freudian psychology, my eyes kind of glaze over. I just can't seem to get the concepts in my head in a way that makes sense. So I may have some distorted knowledge of quantum physics on the basis of my own way of looking at it and acquiring whatever I see as knowledge through reading about it, investigating it, but interpreting it in a very, very distorted way. So we're going to see this term used, afflicted wisdom, a little bit later on. As I mentioned, that is how we have these incorrect views or afflicted views, ways of looking at things, knowing things that are not how they actually exist. It's kind of interesting. Once more, this elevated wisdom and exalted wisdom is important to develop on the path. But our wisdom right now may not be so exalted, may not be so elevated. So we do have to treat it in that way. Let's go back to the text then. And whoops, that's not the one. Look at what else is said here. Again, you can carry this forward. That's what I was trying to say when I broke away from the screen, was that everything we do, all the time we spend in practice, study, meditation, what have you, creates imprints that we can be carrying forward to our next life. get another good existence like this one, we can very quickly bring some of this back into the forefront of our awareness and continue our spiritual progress. Oops, I went backwards there. Okay. I want to share what Geshe Rabten says here that Venerable Gyatso quotes. Intelligence or knowledge can be applied in unwholesome as well as wholesome pursuits. For example, it has enabled people to construct highly complex weapons of destruction on the one hand, and codes of ethical conduct on the other. You know, everything from what is most non-virtuous of causing mass destruction in our world to, causing unbelievable virtuous results through attending to one's ethical behavior. But by far the most important role it plays is that of discerning the nature of ultimate truth, selflessness, emptiness, both for the inference as well as for the immediate perception of selflessness. A keen intelligence is the vital factor in reaching a comprehension. Nevertheless, without being mounted upon the firm concentration of serenity, as we called it earlier, or mental quiescence, it alone, knowledge alone, lacks any power to cause one to progress along the path to liberation. So this is just pointing to the fact that we do have to, if we're going to affect some more lasting change in our minds, you do have to have a very deep meditative stabilization, deep concentration, and unite that with this penetrative insight or wisdom. Finally, it says, similarly, mental quiescence and the various other levels of concentration also lack any liberating power by themselves alone. Thus, it is essential to combine the firm concentration of mental quiescence, serenity, sometimes called calm abiding, with the intelligent recognition of special insight, penetrative insight, highly developed wisdom. So I'm just pointing that out. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later when we get into some of these virtuous mental factors, as well as even talking about the ignorance that is the root problem. Remember in the first class, I introduced you to the tree of samsara, the roots of that tree being the ignorance that doesn't see reality correctly, particularly doesn't understand how the I, the capital I, exists, the self, the person. So again, that is where we are particularly going to utilize the concentration. Mindfulness, of course, is a basis for concentration, and the wisdom as an opportunity for us to overcome that ignorance, to uproot the tree of samsara, to break free of all this nonsense once and for all. And that's not the main focus of this course. I will go into it, as absolutely, you've got my promise on that. But it's not the initial thing we need to do. The initial thing we need to do is gain some understanding of who are all the other crazy roommates that we have in our mind and try to discern what we're going to do with them. How are we going to listen to these folks? Are we going to, ignore those folks? Whatever the case might be. Once we have a better understanding of these mental factors and the role that they play, then we will have calmed the mind to a great degree already. Then engaging in concentration and developing wisdom becomes easier. And can do it simultaneously, but I think we definitely have to start addressing all the crazy, disturbing things that are going on in our own minds right now. Much less the root of all of that, what's causing all of our problems. That will follow from all of this work. Let me see if there was anything else I wanted to share from this section. There is kind of going into these 6 powers. I think this too is a little more than what you need for this course. And I'm going to jump forward when we get to the next section. I mentioned this last week. I'm not going to start with virtuous mental factors. I'm actually going to dig right into the afflictions. So, is there anything more I wanted to say on that? I don't think so. So as I said, there is a mindfulness exercise at the end for the next week or so. If you can pay attention to those and see, might be good, again, with 2 different types of experiences at least. Those that are virtuous, when you're doing your Dharma study, your meditation, your practice, how are they operating? How are they playing a role? In your aspiration, the appreciation or belief in that, the mindfulness, the concentration, the wisdom or knowledge. And then how are they playing a role sometimes when non-virtue arises? Because we can become quite convinced of the qualities and the value of things that are not worth following. We do that a lot with our afflicted states of mind, right? Like when you do have some object, well, let's talk about an object of desire, because that's what we're going to move to tonight, is into the very first of the main afflictions, the root afflictions, which is attachment or desire. We put a lot of value into objects that induce pleasure. that give us pleasurable feelings that may not be that wholesome. And because we get a lot of our pleasure from the sense objects, things that we engage in that induce those pleasurable sensations that kind of keep us feeling like life is good, everything's fine, what have you. Well, that's a whole thought process involved in how we're relating to those objects. We have an aspiration to acquire them. We have an appreciation for them in our lives. We become mindful of them and constantly think about them, don't forget them, so that we, keep on that track of acquiring them and what have you. And then we stay concentrated and to some degree having some level of single pointedness in regard to those objects. And the knowledge that is influencing that, again, is a distorted state of mind that is looking at those as things we need to acquire to accomplish happiness in this life, not recognizing that they are actually the source of our suffering. At least this process is the source of our suffering. We're not putting all the onus on those objects. It's our relationship to those objects that is causing us to suffer. So these 5 do play a role in virtuous states of mind, but they also are playing a very involved role in how we relate to those objects that lead us down the path of non-virtue, that cause us to get into a mind of acquisition with regard to what is pleasant, that we have strong attachment for, a mind of anger and frustration for those things that are unpleasant, and so on. You're going to see that these play a role in regard to all the various afflictions that do come into play. Let's talk about these very briefly first, and then we'll go to the text, as well as I've got brief descriptions of each of the, of attachment. We're not going to go into all of these tonight. These are where we are really going to slow down and get into how do we actually work with each of these, especially these, because these are called the 6 root afflictions. You hear this term root very frequently. I already mentioned ignorance is the root of cyclic existence or samsara. That's the single root. But then we have these 6 that are called root afflictions because they're the primary causes of samsara. They work in tandem. But they are also the root of what we call the close or the secondary afflictions. There are 20 of those on our list. And you'll see that on that handout that I've given you that's got all of the various mental factors listed of the 51. The first of them is attachment or desire. I'm going to go into that tonight. The second one is anger or aversion. Anger or aversion is the opposite response. Attachment, it relates to things that we find pleasant. Anger or aversion is in regard to things that we find unpleasant, that induce that feeling, that experience. Whoops, I'm sorry, didn't mean to click on that. Ignorance or confusion is the third one. Sometimes these 3, the first 3, are called the 3 root afflictions, again, to give another term, but the other one is, they're called the 3 poisons frequently, because they kind of, the real substance of all of what poisons are experienced. The neutrality of ignorance that doesn't really see things as they are, the strong aversion energy that happens when we have the unpleasant experience and anger arises, and then the desirous energy towards the pleasant things in our lives. Those are the 3 main responses that we have towards what is pleasant, what is unpleasant, and what is neutral. Then we have 3 more that we're adding on the list: pride, afflicted doubt, and afflicted views, which are really afflicted wisdom, afflicted ways of looking at things. Let's take a look at these afflictions in general first, through what Geshe Rabten is saying. Whoops. Now we shall consider the afflictions. These are the mental factors of the mind that, since they are responsible for every form of suffering and discontent we experience, are regarded as unwholesome. Now, when he uses the word unwholesome here, I've got a footnote on that. Note that unwholesome here does not necessarily mean non-virtuous. This is a footnote I've put together. This isn't from Geshe Rabten. This is because there are afflictions, such as that ignorance of the nature of reality, that's the root of samsara, the tree of samsara, and what's called the view of the transitory group or collection, which is an afflicted view. It's among those 5 afflicted views that are included in that 6th root affliction. And those can arise also with virtuous mental factors. Remember that tree of samsara? It's got the roots of ignorance. It has the trunk, which has both virtuous and non-virtuous states of mind that arise within that ignorance. And then it has the branches of the karmic deeds that we do with those virtuous or non-virtuous states of mind, and then the fruits of those. So virtue even arises from the root of ignorance. As long as we are still contaminated by that ignorance, our virtue will only bring about the pleasant fruits of samsara. It won't bring about anything outside of that conditioned existence. So there are some of these mental factors that we're going to call afflictions, delusions, negative emotions, but they are not inducing a suffering experience necessarily. Because when we have the mind of ignorance together with our practice of generosity, we actually have good results from that. We feel good in the moment at being generous, but that also produces future experiences of resources in our later in this life or in a future life. So once more, what I'm pointing out here, and this will become clear when we look at those mental factors, is that when we identify, we're going to go through later the virtuous mental factors, those are by nature virtuous. When we get through this whole category of afflictions, the 6 root, the 20 close afflictions, not every one of them is by nature non-virtuous. Many of them are, don't get me wrong. And I'll point that out as we go through them. Attachment, the first one we're going to look at tonight, by its very nature, when we are talking about this mental factor of attachment, desire, it is non-virtuous. It leads us down a path of non-virtue. You cannot have attachment for something that is wholesome and virtuous. You can only have it towards contaminated objects that will eventually, again, result in some future suffering by virtue of the way that you have engaged with that object. All right. So in the very next slide, he says, they are characterized by being conceptual mental factors. This is one of the most mind-blowing things that happened to me when I came to these teachings many years ago. I explained how I started studying this with Venerable Rabina back in 1996. She pointed out that these are conceptual minds. I know it doesn't feel like it when attachment arises or when anger arises. It is actually a thought process, albeit a very conditioned habitual one, but it is something that can be deconstructed in terms of what are we thinking at that moment in that flash of anger, that flash of desire. It says here, being conceptual mental factors that, on arising in the mind, cause disturbance and unrest. In the case of gross attachment, hatred, and so forth, this disturbing nature is quite evident, but we may wonder how such afflictions as laziness or dullness disturb the mind. They're among the secondary ones, the close afflictions. The afflictions are classified into 2 groups, the 6 root afflictions and the 20 proximate or close afflictions. The root afflictions act as the very basis for all intellectual distortion and emotional conflict, and subsequently give rise to contaminated actions that propel us into states of samsara. That's these first 6 that we're going to look at, beginning with attachment. While under their domination, our existence becomes one of bondage in which we lack the freedom to determine our own destiny. The proximate afflictions are so called because, on the one hand, they are aspects or extensions of the root afflictions, and on the other, because they occur in direct dependence upon them. They are derived from them. We're going to see this when we eventually get to them. So the point is that some of these other ones, they do not necessarily arise in a much grosser way, but they play a subtle role, such as laziness and so on, in affecting our behavior, in affecting how we go about engaging or not engaging in our spiritual practice. And we'll see these. As I said earlier tonight, all of these 51 are set out in terms of getting to understand our minds in relation to Buddhist practice. So we're looking at these as all playing a role of the first 6, especially as being highlighted as the real problematic ones. These are the ones that are mainly keeping us in samsara, especially those first 3, and more particularly the ignorance of the nature of reality. But the proximate or the near afflictions are also playing a role in keeping us from being fully engaged in what will help us to have greater levels of happiness in future lives, in this life, what have you. Let's look at attachment. Attachment, this is a little passage once more from Dalai Lama and Venerable Chodron from the book I cited earlier. This arises based on projecting or exaggerating the attractiveness of an object within cyclic existence. People, things, ideas, places, and so forth. It wishes for, takes a strong interest in, and clings to that object. And in Western psychology, attachment sometimes is referred to in a positive way as the bond that occurs between like an infant and the parent that is nursing and tending to them, what have you. So again, attachment here has a very different connotation. It is our getting involved unhealthily with objects that bring us pleasure, that are seen as attractive, but we exaggerate and project more attractiveness on the object than what is actually there. This is one of the main features of all of these delusions in terms of some level of exaggeration, some level of mental fabrication. Once more, because they are in the domain of the conceptual mind. Remember what I've talked about earlier. The conceptual mind takes an image of that object, an idea of that object, and begins to embellish it, paint all over it, cause all sorts of other things to arise on the basis of what isn't even the object to begin with. Kind of a snapshot of the object if you're talking visually, but it can also be, a recording of the object if you're talking auditorially or whatever. You've got all these different ideas of objects that we bring in, and then we start working with them. Lama Yeshe, and of course, even in the text that we have, Venerable Gyatso, he uses the example primarily of our attachment towards people, especially in intimate relationships, where you have a being who you have seen and gotten to know, and you have no doubt, to some degree, even if you've known them for many years, still exaggerated the pleasantness of that being. Gone beyond what is actually appearing to you, what you karmically experience on the basis of some positive karma that allows them to appear to you in a good manner, having good qualities, things that you like, that you find pleasing. But we elevate those. Recall when you fell in love for the first time, the one that didn't last, probably a lot of them didn't last if you're me, but the idea is that you have this initial experience of finding someone to be somewhat pleasing. You like the way they talk, what they say, the way they joke with this, and then you start seeing them in this elevated way. It's like you're putting them on a pedestal. You're making them into this ideal person that is just so perfect. Oh, they're just amazing. All I can do is think about them, their wonderful qualities. I can't wait to be with them again. And then sometimes, that wears off, right? You start seeing the warts and the other parts of them, and so you kind of go, oh, they're not really as attractive as what I thought they were, and I really don't like their personality as much as I thought I did. You start seeing other sides of them, and they're coming down off the pedestal really quickly sometimes, and you're the one that put them up there, right? It doesn't have anything to do with them. They were who they were, and maybe they did hide some things initially because they were worried that you might not like them because of those things. That does happen. But nonetheless, we make an interpretation that is frequently an exaggeration. And with the mind of attachment, absolutely. This is what's happening. We are looking at that person and unfairly elevating them to that degree. It's no wonder they can't live up to it. So this is how relationships often end in that real strong disappointment, because we thought the person was something different than what they were. And who is the real person? That's a whole nother mystery that we'll get into at a later point. But this is an operation that we go through with regard to all of these delusions. They all have some level of distortion. The fundamental distortion is thinking that they are real from their side, thinking that they exist from their side. That's that ignorance. It's the root of all of this. But on the basis of holding them to be real, we then add stuff on. We exaggerate. I want to get through our text at least to talk a little bit about attachment. Got a few more minutes, I think, to go. Oops, that's not where I wanted to go. I was already done with that. Let me pull up the text. There's the chart, but I'll get it to the text right away here. No, here. All right, now I'm going to have to go forward here. Let's see, I'm going forward to somewhere around 99, and it's 100 in the file, but page 99. This is where the 6 root afflictions are introduced. Here's what Venerable Gyatso says. Attachment is a mental factor that sees a contaminated object as attractive and wishes to acquire it, to be close to it, to not be separated from it. Contaminated objects are things that have arisen from karma and mental afflictions. In other words, everything in our world. People arise from karma and afflictions. Objects of attachment like desirable food or whatever the case might be arise from those same factors. Although attachment observes its object correctly, in the sense that it is, observing it and seeing some attractive qualities to it, because that's how we karmically experience that object. Our contact with it induces feelings of pleasure. You know, it is a mistaken consciousness that because it apprehends the object incorrectly in terms of this improper mental attention that exaggerates the good qualities of the object or projects non-existent good qualities onto the object, and attachment holds these exaggerated and superimposed qualities to truly exist on the side of the object. You know, we believe that they are there. That's why, again, it's so hard when we break up with somebody to see that the person that we were in love with and had this infatuation with isn't really what we thought they were. So this is what is going on, is that we are approaching an object that we have a particular feeling for. We are getting that pleasant vibe, if you will, something nice, attractive about that, which is once more the ripening of our past karma. But we go through a whole mental process of building that all up into something that is totally unrealistic. We're doing that with everything that we experience that's pleasurable to some degree, I would say. There's some level of attachment. Some things we have stronger attachment to than others. But we have lots of sense objects in our life, right? That these are all the contaminated objects that we often have very unhealthy relationships with. Or we have strong aversion to particular food and strong, like and desire for other food. And this happens with regard to all of the other sense objects that we relate to. But it can also happen even in the mental consciousness with regard to things of our past. Sometimes we embellish the past, right? We have this nostalgia that looks back on, oh, it was so nice when I was there in Hawaii and on the beach and da-da-da-da. But you don't realize that, maybe it wasn't as pleasant. You got sunburnt and, there were a lot of sand fleas and it really wasn't as pleasant as you're making it out to be. We have this tendency of exaggerating and embellishing everything. Let me see how much of this I can go through. I don't want to go too late because I do want to allow a little bit of time if there's a question or two. I would encourage you to read this. This is just talking about how attachment also plays a pretty heavy role in terms of our cycling from life to life. Differentiating love and attachment is very important. We can have love for somebody, such as somebody that we're in a relationship with, but that can be divorced from attachment. Attachment and love don't have to come together. Love is a genuine positive feeling of positive regard for another being, wanting them to be happy. Attachment gets very selfish. I want to point this out before we close tonight, though. Let's make no mistake. Pleasure and happiness are not attachment. The feeling of pleasure and happiness, which once more, that's why we looked at those 5 ever-present mental factors. You have a feeling of pleasantness that is arising when that object of attachment comes into your experience. It is not attachment in and of itself. But in our innate confusion about reality, we cannot experience pleasure without becoming attached. Or to some degree, as I said, in some things we have greater attachment towards than others. Attachment clings to, let's say most, I don't know, all is a pretty strong statement, but I think for most of us, that's probably the truth. It clings to these objects of pleasure, and especially to those we claim or desire as close friends or sexual partners. And this is where he talks about a lot of this from that perspective of how people play a role in terms of inducing strong desire in us, people that we have a sexual intimate relationship with. It's just a part of being a human being, unless you've taken robes and are a monk or a nun and decide that you're going to close that part of your life off, or you do that without taking robes. Many people decide they don't want to be involved in intimate relationships, but it's a strong source of desire in our world. You can start with lesser objects to focus on, though. Look at the attachment you have to cake, or we're coming up on the holidays. You're going to be around a lot of objects of attachment if you go out and about and are with people at various parties and what have you. Lots of things that kind of draw you in, that you go in and you look at the table of food and you immediately kind of target in on one thing that looks like what you want to first eat or whatever. Those look really, really good, right? I'm going to encourage you in the second mindfulness exercise. I was hoping to get to 3 of them, but at least 2 to work with over these next few weeks. Besides being aware of those 5 object ascertaining or focusing mental factors, the second one is to be aware of how attachment is arising. Try to see that it is playing a role in terms of embellishing your experience of that object. Let me actually put the one on the screen. I'm going to have to jump forward here in terms of my slides because should I do that one or not? I think this is something we've already talked about. I just included in there from Geshe Rabten. Okay. So those are all the other factors I didn't get time to go into. All right. So as you come into contact with objects that produce a pleasurable feeling, notice how the mistaken conception of attachment arises. And I highlight here these 6 factors. They are explained in Venerable Gyatso's text, but I was hoping to teach them because one of the factors he has isn't quite the way I learned it. And so I wanted to correct something there from my perspective. Again, I'm not saying he's wrong. It's just he had a different teacher for that, perhaps. But there are factors that give rise to it. What I want you to focus on, though, is really the one that was already highlighted. It's called that inappropriate mental attention. It means that, again, you're exaggerating things. You're looking at things through a distorted lens. You're embellishing that object of pleasure with all kinds of overlay. And then also notice whether just having that awareness of the process of attachment arising can disrupt its development. So I won't have time to go into all this, but these 6, once I go through them once with regard to attachment, they play a role in any affliction arising. They get defined a little differently in terms of that particular experience of attachment versus anger, but they are common. And one of them, once more, is this. It's the 6th one on the Venerable Gyatso's list. He called it there incorrect or inappropriate thinking. He said it exaggerates, for example, the person who's our partner, their good qualities, ignores the bad qualities, obsessively dwells upon them again and again, what have you. You can do that once more with any object of attachment. Focus in on that one because we've talked about that one a little bit, and that one's, I think, kind of easy to understand. But obviously, the other 5 do play a role as well in terms of our experience of that delusion of attachment arising. So is everyone clear on mindfulness exercise? Maybe I'll reword it a little bit before I put the file out there on the drive. Again, I will copy all of these slides I went through tonight. And then that way you can refer to those. And feel free to read what Venerable Gyatso has. It's nothing he says in there is wrong. He just has this one of them that he's introducing in a slightly different way than the way that I was taught. So any questions on this or on the exercise and what we talked about tonight? I mean, yes, please, Jackie. Online, yeah. You need to unmute, Jackie. Sorry, we're not hearing. There you go.
Yeah, I was finding my mic. The afflictive views, 5 individual views. Can you just so little time, right? But yeah, some examples perhaps.
Well, one of them is that one I introduced that isn't necessarily non-virtuous, which is this, it's called the view of the transitory group or collection. Let's leave those words aside. It's a false view of I, of the sense of I. It's kind of a subset of the bigger ignorance that isn't seeing anything correctly. We're distorting the nature of reality in terms of how things actually exist. But this one is quite specifically looking at the I. Another one in that category is what we often call wrong views, where we negate something that the Buddha says exists, holding it to not exist, or we perhaps embellish things that don't exist or that do exist. That don't exist by giving them existence. So we think that things that the Buddha says exist don't exist, or we think the things the Buddha says don't exist do exist. So we can't have different, again, afflicted views that are these afflicted wisdoms or knowledges. May not get to all of those because, again, I'm trying to really stay focused on everything that stays quite in a very practical vein for us with regard to these 51 mental factors, because I've only got, another 8 classes or something, I think, to go through the remaining portion of this text. But know that what I'm touching on, though, as I was saying earlier, in regard to those 6 factors that I mentioned that are in the text that I will be presenting at the beginning of the next class in 3 weeks, go through those. In regard to this sense of an exaggeration and what have you, all of these are going to be seen in every one of these afflictions to some degree. So it's a similar idea about them. It's just they're different flavors. Once more, different roommates that we kind of have that can pop up. Those that can pop up when things are unpleasant, those that can pop up when things are pleasant. And we have to differentiate even the ones within that because they have different gradations and different roles that they play. This is what we're trying to do in this. Yes, Hassan. Sure. She's asking for a simple recap of the assignment. Two things. One, in regard to the 5 that are object determining, try to notice how they are playing a role in terms of your relationship to when you're kind of getting at an object, ascertaining an object, either virtuously or non-virtuously. Because we have a level of, again, afflicted wisdom that's operative with regard to these objects when we have a non-virtuous state of mind arising. Secondly, watch how attachment arises. Again, if you want to read on these other steps or things that play a role, I can tell you really quickly. One of them is the object, right? Only certain objects will trigger attachment. We have other objects that trigger aversion or anger or what have you, but those are objects for us that are inducing a pleasant feeling. You know, such as like whatever food you like. Maybe you really like a delicious plate of roasted Brussels sprouts or something. That can be an object attachment for you, because when that appears, when that's the steaming dish on the table, when you go to the party or the dinner or whatever, that's what you're drawn to. You go, oh wow, those look really, really good. That's what I want to eat, right? Then, of course, we embellish. We do that inappropriate mental attention. I'm asking you quite singly to focus on that one. You can talk, again, think about the other ones that are covered in the text, but I will teach on them when we return. The main one is to look at how you are exaggerating the positive qualities of that object. You're elevating it, putting it up again on a bit of a pedestal and seeing it as better than it actually is on the basis of the smell, the sight, the taste, what have you. Yes, please. Let's get the microphone over there. I'm sorry. What's your name, by the way? Patrick.
Thank you.
Please.
How are you defining attachment? Is that kind of what we're talking about in a way?
Well, in terms of the mindfulness exercise, it's watching when attachment arises. Attachment being that exaggeration of the object, are going towards it, being drawn towards it, and kind of clinging to it, wanting to pull it into our sphere of experience and not separate from it. That's a way of describing it. I don't want to, it's not a technical definition, but we know what attachment feels like when we experience it many, many times every day. So be kind of aware as you go about your daily business and make sure you're safe in this. I don't want you to be doing this when you've got things going on that you need to pay attention to, but when you can, examine what is happening with the mind of attachment. Try to pinpoint that particular level of embellishment, exaggeration that you're adding to it, that is over and above what is actually there. Now, what is actually there becomes another mystery that we're going to talk about later. Yes, Lou.
Barbara has a question.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I haven't looked at the screen. Barbara, please.
Hi again, Don. Thank you so much for your teaching. My question comes to attachment to people, and I will use my 3 grandchildren as an example. I see and I really focus on their positive, virtuous qualities. I'm not aware of their negative ones. But I guess my question with them and just other people in general, where is the line of focusing on their true positive attributes, and then when am I embellishing them? I don't know where that line is. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense. I think what we have to delineate is what is the state of mind that's observing those qualities. So I mean, there are some people I'm not saying this is your case, but when we get into this, like you might be looking at those and you are, through the force of your focusing on their virtuous qualities, you are ignoring things that might need to be addressed about their non-virtuous and their behavior that is not in line with being a good person in this world. If you have genuine love and a caring attitude for that person, you don't just focus on what's positive and hold that to be the whole person, because that's the basis for developing a sense of attachment to the person. Whereas having a more realistic view that sees the person in their entirety, that understands they have negative qualities, they have positive qualities, and you hold them through the lens of wanting to help them to address what is necessary in their life to overcome those negative qualities, to enhance the positive ones. That's a much more wholesome state of mind. Again, it really depends upon when you're observing those, what is the mind doing with those? What is the mind trying to get at with those? Are you clear in that yourself, or maybe it was expressed and I didn't hear it? I'm not sure. When you're observing your grandchildren through that lens,
Mhm.
is it that you are not wanting to see what is unpleasant about them, or is it?
No, I do see what is unpleasant about them. If needed, I address it, but that's not what I focus on. I am one that focuses more on their positiveness and try
Mhm.
to enhance and make that a focus. As
And that's
opposed to,
yeah.
again, I see the flip side. And I do in most people, but again, that's just not where I put my focus. I want to enhance and
Uh-huh.
encourage the positiveness in people.
And I think that's a very positive motivation, and that's clearer now to me than that when you are engaging with them and seeing them through that lens, you are wanting to help accentuate and develop those positive qualities
Mhm.
in them. And of course, over time, maybe as they grow older, you might be able to also help address the negative tendencies and have them see. But as I've mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned in this course, I mentioned it frequently, these two we do in tandem often, right? We see what is negative and we address it by supplanting it with something that is virtuous, that is positive. So, you know, it's just watching these things. I guess the most important thing I want to emphasize in what you shared is that we can have a lot of attachment for people when we're only focusing on what is wholesome and good. And we are also exaggerating that to some degree. We are bringing it up to another level to where we again want to cling to that and that idea. Then we can't see anything or that's negative about the person. This happens a lot with parents, right? Parents, they go to the school meeting with the teachers and the teachers say, guess what? Your child's been doing this and that, whatever. And you go, no, my child never. My child would never do that, because they're so attached to a view of their child as only being positive, only being delightful, only being courteous, only being kind, that they can't even think that their child would be anything but that. And that's not realistic. And that's a form of attachment where we get attached to an idea of who the person is, as opposed to who the person really is, where we take it warts and all, where we are able to hold the view. And then we have very positive attitudes of love and compassion on the basis of that. These are tricky things. I know familial attachments are a real problem in Buddhism, because we do benefit to some degree from having some concern for the person, and they benefit from our concern as well. But we also have to be careful that we're not distorting that relationship and the view of the other person. So maybe we'll talk about this a bit more as we get into attachment more in the next session. I do want to spend, as I said, a fair amount of time on some of these that are the root ones and the main ones, because all the other ones follow from them, and they're just variations that are iterations of them, if you will. Does that make some sense, Barbara? Yeah.
It did. It made a lot of sense, and I want to talk about it more.
I understand.
Thank
We'll
you.
hopefully have an opportunity for
Thank you.
more digesting of that. But think about it over the break too. It's just kind of be with those thoughts and try to dissect them a little more and see what's going on when I'm observing my grandchildren and when I'm seeing them in that way. And is it as wholesome and pure as I think it is, or is it perhaps there's some other things going on under the surface that are also happening? But anyway, I think it's good. This is what we need to do, is kind of pick apart these experiences we're having. All right, let's do a little dedication. Shella, can you get that on? Yeah, she's got it on the screen coming up, and then we'll do prayers together. Again, this is also using our minds to think about what we have done here and wanting all of what we've done to bring about the best possible result of our own enlightenment, and then our ability to help others to do the same. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then let's do the prayer for His Holiness. We won't do the one for Rinpoche tonight, but as we recite this prayer, think about all of our amazing teachers in this world, especially the Dalai Lama, creating that positive energy for them to remain in this world and have all their holy wishes be fulfilled. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And we also dedicate for the very swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director of the FPMT. We also dedicate for all the beings that we're holding in our hearts, whatever suffering they're experiencing, may they be free of that immediately through what we've done here tonight. May those beings as well find everything that brings them to perfect peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings. So again, I'm going to reword that second mindfulness exercise so it's very clear. So you'll have that as well. I didn't point out the readings, but again, there is that additional text that I gave you that I haven't referred to at all yet by Lama Yeshe. Whoops. And that's UE reference materials, mind and mental factors. So I'm going to encourage you to read a fair amount, but you got some time, again, 3 weeks till we meet again. Just go right up to anger, which is on page 40. There's a fair amount there about how the mind works in these first 5 mental factors that we already looked at. But I figured, yeah, we'll do that reading at this point, and then we'll accompany our reading of the main text with that. But it's good if you can spend a little bit of time over the holidays, reviewing some of this and reading. So sorry I kept you all here a bit later than usual. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a very safe, peaceful, healthy holiday season, and I will see you in the new year. Again, we meet on January 8th, I think is the next time. So, all right. I'll see some of you before then. I'll be teaching again here tomorrow night and then on Sunday. But all right, be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Linda.